From Willowdale, from the Cedarville Ravine, near my apartment, basically in the St. Clair Bathurst area. Clayton and I were just talking about infrastructure, and so this is going to be a quick video. We're just going to deal. Okay, we all saw what happened in the Carolinas the last number of days with the hurricane. And the massive flooding that still continues, and the breaches of levees and dams. And this is we're in the Cedarville Ravine, which is here basically just off Heath Street between Bathurst and Spadina, just north of St. Clair. These ravine systems are really part of Toronto's flood protection systems. They're all basically constructed after Hurricane Hazel in 1954, which is a hurricane that caused a lot of death and destruction in Toronto. And we built up these massive conservation areas north of the city, all around the city.
We were way ahead of Elliott Capel, right?
We were real ahead of the times. Albion Hills is a classic example. There were tons. And Cedarville, this is a wetland. This goes to go down deep in there. It's a wetland. And so last year with Harvey that hit Houston, they had paved over all the wetlands. They had paved over a lot of what you see here. And of course, Harvey devastated Houston and caused a lot of flooding, a lot of death. Toronto's not perfect. We still have flooding in the lower Don Valley and stuff like that, but we've pretty much done a pretty good job of making sure if we have extreme weather events, we don't have a lot of flooding. There's a lot more to do because we're going to get a lot more extreme weather events due to climate change. But so yeah, we're in the Cedarville Ravine here in Midtown Toronto between Bathurst and Spadina, just north of St. Clair. And these are wetlands below us, and they prevent a lot of flooding. And so when we have extreme weather events and heavy rain, as we did a week ago with the remnants of Tropical Storm Gordon, we're probably not getting much from Florence, but we don't get a lot of flooding. So in the Carolinas, they're getting a lot of flooding, and levees are bursting, and you have to ask yourself, okay, this is the wealthiest country in the world. Why aren't they putting the Carolinas get hurricanes? They get extreme weather. Just like the Gulf Coast, like Houston and New Orleans, they get extreme weather. Why aren't they putting the money into infrastructure? And they're not. So Donald Trump's tax cuts, which benefit corporations and all that, are not going to benefit. They're not putting any money into infrastructure because there is no money. The U.S., as I said in a previous video, the budget, the U.S. debt, our deficit is 4.5% of GDP. It's going up. The U.S., there is no money for infrastructure. Donald Trump talked about putting a lot of money into infrastructure. There's no money going to infrastructure. The Americans have no money. It all goes into military spending and to tax cuts for the wealthy.
That's the NATO argument too, right? Like, I mean, it's not that other countries are spending less, it's that the Americans are spending more, and they're feeling the grind.
Exactly. It's that the United States doesn't need to spend the amount of money, $600 billion or whatever they do on the military. They don't. They don't need to fund all these, as we said in previous videos, a war without end. They need to get out of Afghanistan. They need to get a negotiated settlement in Afghanistan. They need to get a settlement in Syria, work with the Russians, work with the Iranians, work with the Iranians in Afghanistan. They need to stop spending money on the military. I mean, the U.S. spends more money on the military than all the countries in the world combined. And yet, what happens in the Carolinas, all that flooding and all that, 18 deaths probably because we're going to rise. It doesn't need to happen. They could probably actually do something. The Dutch put money into infrastructure. Rotterdam has a system where they can close the levees. They can actually close off Holland from the North Sea, and they can actually even parking garages in Rotterdam will turn into flood prevention. They can let the water flow into these parking garages. The Dutch have devised this amazing system so they don't get flooding. Yes, they don't get hurricanes in the North Sea, no question. They don't get hurricanes, but they get some pretty violent weather. The Dutch have spent, you know, Schiphol, one of the major airports on planet Earth, Amsterdam Schiphol, sits below sea level. It'll never flood because they've built the infrastructure, the levees and everything to survive. They've built the infrastructure. They spend billions of dollars on it, so the Netherlands doesn't flood. Yes, they don't get hurricanes, they don't get typhoons, but they get some pretty nasty weather. But they don't flood because they spend billions on it. And that comes out of tax dollars, and the Dutch pay the tax dollars. The Americans don't want to pay tax dollars, they want tax cuts. So, New Orleans floods, the Carolinas flood, Houston floods, you know, and that's why it happens. So you want your tax cuts for wealthy Americans and corporations. You want to spend billions on the military, which is not needed. And then you have flooding in the Carolinas, and no one even questions it. Like, no one even seems to care, you know? It's weird. So here we are, Cedarville Ravine. This is where tax dollars were spent well in the 50s and 60s.
That's where I got my degree as well.
This is where you got your university degree. That's another story.
A soundscape, right?
Yeah. But this is an example of where tax dollars building the infrastructure in the Greater Toronto area, all over the Greater Toronto area. In the 50s and 60s, after Hurricane Hazel 1954, that's where tax dollars are spent well. And there's a lot more to be done in the city of Toronto in terms of preventing flooding. You know, it happens, right? You see it happen all the time, particularly in the lower Don Valley. But this is where tax dollars need to be spent. The Dutch spend the money. We spent the money in Toronto, and hopefully we'll spend more on flood prevention.
Trees and mangrove.
We get the remnants of hurricanes. We don't get hurricanes. We get the remnants of them. But we do with climate change. We're going to get a lot more of these heavy rain events. So, and the typhoon that hit the other thing I want to mention in this video is we're so centric. This typhoon that hit the Philippines and southern China and Hong Kong, it was severe. Winds far bigger than what hit the Carolinas. Because we have such an America-centric news, we really don't hear much about it. Yes, it was reported, but the typhoons that are hitting in the Philippines is ground zero, because they get hit by these massive typhoons that are far more powerful than the hurricanes that hit parts of North America. And Philippines just gets devastated, and they move on to southern China, Hong Kong and southern China, and northern Vietnam. And it's funny, it is reported, but it just doesn't get any sort of focus like the ones. I know all news is local, but let's remember that typhoons hitting parts of Asia are far more severe than the hurricanes that are hitting the Americas. And so yeah, I guess that's all I want to say. I could talk about other issues that are in the news, Kavanaugh and all that, but I just want to, we're in the we're just in the Cedarville Ravine tonight, which is a flood protection measure, and we're just talking about how money should be spent, especially in the time of...
Well, not on CNN, that's for sure.
Yeah. You won't, yeah, exactly. Even on CNN, you don't, where's the talk about why we aren't spending money on reinforcing the levees? Why aren't we spending money? Why does these communities flood? Like they don't have to. I mean, you can't prevent everything, okay? But you can mitigate the effects of hurricanes. You need to spend the money. New Orleans was a joke. You know, the U.S. actually invited the Dutch in to help them reinforce the levees after Katrina. New Orleans was a joke, totally unprotected. It's a city like Amsterdam that sits pretty much below sea level. You got to spend the money. Okay, the Dutch spend the money to make sure the Holland doesn't flood, and that's tax dollars. The Americans don't want to spend the tax dollars, and Canadians got to start spending more tax dollars because we're going to get more extreme weather events in many parts of Canada, particularly in southern Ontario. But of course, in Western Canada with wildfires and all that, we need to spend the money. So that's it. But yes, the thing is, U.S. You want tax cuts? You want to spend money on the military? You don't want to spend money on infrastructure and shoring up your levees and putting wetlands in to make sure there isn't this massive flooding that's happening in the Carolinas. Yeah, you got to spend the money. You got to spend tax dollars, and that's
liberal all the way.
Yeah, you can't have these massive tax cuts that will leave, and then spend money on the military and leave no money for infrastructure.
Well, that's the difference between neoconservative and neoliberal, right? Neoliberal is a much more worldly sort of position when it comes to spending and government, whereas neoconservative is more of an American dream when it comes to involvement in Israel and well,
neoconservative, neoliberal is kind of
the same thing. Yeah.
It's basically tax cuts for the wealthy, very little spending on basic
competitive markets, though.
Cuts to Social Security,
right?
And anyways.
Well, I believe in competitive markets, to tell you the truth.
Yeah. But the bottom line is, if you live in a society that functions, especially in a society like the United States, which is really prone to storms. Like I was in southern Florida a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. Miami is totally prone to flooding. And at least in Florida they have wetlands. In Florida they've done some things to mitigate. In Houston they did nothing. They paved over the wetlands, and then they had this massive flooding due to Harvey. At least in Toronto, after one hurricane, 50 years, 55, 60 years ago, we did things like this is a classic example, the Cedarville Ravine. We have wetlands, we have conservation areas, we have our ravines, and this is good. We need to do more because extreme weather is going to come more and more and more, and we don't know what we're going to get in the coming months. Florence is not going to hit us, but Gordon did last week, and we got a lot of rain. So yeah, you gotta spend money on infrastructure, especially in an era of climate change, and the Americans don't want to spend it. And we saw with New York with Sandy Hook, and there's going to be flooding. Even during Sandy Hook, Wall Street was flooded. Come on, you got to spend money, Americans. You got to spend money. Forget the tax cuts. Forget spending billions on the military, which you don't need, which is not needed. And we see what's happening in the Carolinas this week. Flooding you can't mitigate it. You can't prevent it all, obviously, but you can mitigate it. And no reason levees should collapse as they have been in the Carolinas. Spend the money, okay? And that's it, Cleve.
Okay.
A perfect ending to this. Spend the money, no tax cuts, and Trump doesn't seem to care about any of this. So that's it.
We're done? Okay.